and look at the moon, and you can quickly conclude that the solar system has been a rough neighborhood. It's been beat up pretty bad, and all our space probes to the planets show that the planets also have these craters, and they've obviously been beat up pretty badly. So the universe is the solar system has been a rough neighborhood. And so you and I would be classified as a fiat creationist. We believe God created the heaven and the earth. So we're technically in the catastrophist camp, if you will, with some additional insider prejudice, however you want to express it. Now, uniformitarianism is what's taught, and yet it's subject to some delusions. View any surface of any element in the solar system, and you see craters and other disruptive scars of all kinds. It's interesting that the planet Earth is under a constant rain of interplanetary debris. It picks up 100 tons of extraterrestrial material per day. That most people, unless you're in this field, wouldn't be aware of that. Do you realize that there are over 100 craters on the planet Earth? Most of them get erased through erosion. So some of them, the evidence is very subtle. But in 1908, on June 30th, 1908, there's a very famous event that occurred in Tunguska of Central Siberia. They had an asteroid hit that destroyed 2,000 square kilometers of forest. It was so remote from any civilized town that it wasn't even explored till 17 years later. But it's much studied, of course, since then. It's equivalent, roughly, to a 15 megaton bomb going off. Very famous event. There are lots of pictures and so on. Many of you that have visited the meteor crater in Winslow, Arizona. That was a hit of about the same energy, about 15 megatons apparently. It left a crater about a mile across, and because of the nature of the weather in the southwest, it's relatively well preserved. But in the Yucatan Peninsula, discovered in 1991, there was a gigantic crater, 6 miles in diameter, 100 megaton equivalent. And of course, it's led to conjectures that maybe it had something to do with the disappearance of the dinosaurs. But Kent Hovind will explain to you that there's much more reasonable explanations in Genesis chapter 6, 7, and 8. But anyway, statistically, we get a major crater, a major hit of a major asteroid, about 1 in every 300 years, and 1 in 3 occurs on land. Obviously, since there's a large portion of the Earth that's water, many of these just land in the ocean. And they don't happen that often. I don't know if any of you have noticed any lately, but presumably, statistically, they're frequent. But what I want to get at, it's interesting to understand that the ancient civilizations worshipped these things, these meteorites, what have you. It was a meteorite that led to the Kaaba of Islam. And by the way, that was 2,000 years before Muhammad. Muhammad did not invent Islam, he just repackaged it. It was the worship of the moon god, it was occultic from the beginning. In Athens, Ares is the word for Mars, it was pictured as a source of judgment. Remember Paul on Mars Hill, or the Areopagus, excuse me? This thing led to an ancient institutional court called the Areopagus, where Paul spoke, of course, in Acts 17, called Mars Hill in translation. Dionysus was also a member of that sect in that chapter. The name of the Egyptian city Cairo is from the Arabic word for Mars. So the planet Mars has had more of an impact, pun intended, on the planet Earth than most people have any idea. And it's interesting that it's essentially the site of the Great Pyramid. Now, before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit more about Mars. You know, you and I, when we read Joshua chapter 10, encounter this strange issue of the long day of Joshua. And I think most of us, probably, as sophisticated 20th century scientist-trained people, sort of wince at that because we can't visualize the Earth coming to a stop for a day. But we don't understand it doesn't have to come to a stop for the day to be longer. But the point is, many Christians are sort of embarrassed by Joshua 10. They don't need to be. Let's take a look at it. We're talking about the Battle of Beth Horon. The kings that were adverse to Joshua had confederated under a king who called himself Adonai-Zedek, that is the Lord of Righteousness, or the king of Jerusalem. Well, he, of course, in this battle gets, and his forces get defeated with stones of fire from heaven. And by the way, the marksmanship was really fascinating because these stones, apparently meteorites, were put in orbit maybe thousands and thousands of years earlier, but it was put in orbit so precise that they only hit the enemy, they didn't hit Israel. That's marksmanship, gang. Yeah. But this is the battle. The days were not long enough for some of Joshua's battles, so Joshua pleaded with the Lord to give him a longer day so he could finish the mop-up action. So the sun was commanded to stand still, or be thou silent, technically, to give them more time to complete the route. So the sun and the moon apparently were extended, so to speak, for an entire day. The kings hide in a cave and ultimately are dealt with, and of course the southern strategy is completed, and the rest of the book is really mop-up. This is the pivotal story. Well, what is this business about the sun standing still? Well, if you do some background in this area, you'll discover that the ancient calendars, over a dozen of them that have been identified and that more are based on 360-day years. And we could spend a whole hour getting into the very colorful background here. All the ancient calendars apparently changed about 701 BC. And the Romans, of course, added 4¼ days, essentially. It's not quite that simple, but that's basically it. Hezekiah in Israel resorted to a rather strange formula to adjust the calendar. He added a month 7 times in a 19-year cycle. A very weird formula. If you take 19 years, there's 7 different times that they add a month to the year to make up the difference between the solar and the sidereal year. And but in 701 BC, something caused the calendars to change. And that's a mystery we'll come to in a minute. I mentioned that Mars was worshipped by the ancient cultures. A group of scientists, one of them teaches celestial mechanics at Harvard, another was involved with Boeing in the space program. A guy by Steinhauer, Patch, and Hatch wrote a book, and they built a computer model that reconciles not just 7 different catastrophes in the Bible by the observation that Earth and Mars was apparently originally on resonant orbits. Now, those of you that know about tuning forks, you know how you have 2 tuning forks at the same frequency. You can, across the room, hit one, and the other one will sympathetically vibrate to it. That's a resonant, what we call resonance in engineering. Well, as we've learned about orbital mechanics, orbits are also interactive and can achieve resonance. And they noticed that these scientists noticed that the events in memory of man seem to include catastrophes on a frequency of about every 108 years, or a multiple of 54 in any case. And so this little model will account for at least 7 of the major catastrophes that are recorded in the Bible. And these energy transfers that are involved in near pass-bys, and I'll come to that in a minute, were stabilized in 701 BC. And let's just take a look at this. The Earth, obviously, revolves around the sun. How many knew that? Do you know that goes long before Ptolemy? Do you know that the ancient civilizations in Sumeria and Babylon knew that? It was Ptolemy that messed it all up and got the idea that the sun goes around the Earth. So many of the things that Copernicus had to fight were actually beliefs that were introduced in the middle. The ancients were not as ignorant as some people would like us to believe. But anyway, the point is Earth is on an orbit of 360 days, Mars on 720. And that would put them in resonance. Except it creates a problem. They would have a near pass-by, typically every 108 years in the spring, March 20th, 21st, the spring-type near pass-by, Mars would come from the inside, just after they passed the sun, and the Earth orbit would gain a little energy, Mars would lose a little energy. And by the way, that point on a celestial sphere is called the first point in Aries, which is the ancient word for Mars. And most astronomers don't know why it's called why it has that peculiar label. They attribute it to mythology, but they have no idea why it's really called that. The other near pass-by would occur in the fall, October 25th. In this case, Mars would come from the outside after aphelion, that's after the furthest distance from the sun. It would pass behind the Earth. In this case, the Earth would lose a little energy, Mars would pick it up. So they would be playing this toe dance where the orbits would gain or lose a little energy, but it was in about 701 BC that they stabilized, And where the Earth, they no longer have that pass by because of the changes. Earth picks up 5¼ days. Mars, loses 13 days, and they are where they are today. Now, what's interesting, this is a theory. They're building elaborate computer models, and they really